Welcome to Circle of Fear 1. A slave boy found his master's wife waiting in the barn, but she wasn't there to punish him. The year was 1832, and such unexpected encounters typically ended in pain or worse. But the look in her eyes wasn't anger. It was desperation. What happened between them that day would defy the brutal laws of the plantation, risking everything they had. Neither could have imagined how this forbidden moment would forever alter their lives. Elijah was 16 when he learned to hide his intelligence. On the sprawling Wilkes plantation, with its endless rows of cotton stretching toward the Mississippi horizon, a slave who appeared too smart was a slave who invited trouble. The overseers watched for it, that telltale glint of comprehension, that dangerous spark of awareness that suggested a mind working beyond its assigned station. With sharp eyes that missed nothing, Elijah moved through the cotton fields like a shadow, always watching, always learning, always surviving. His callous hands worked mechanically, picking the white bolls until his fingers bled, while his mind remained his own private sanctuary. Master Jeremiah Wilkes ruled with a whip in one hand and a leather-bound Bible in the other, preaching salvation while dealing damnation from the wide veranda of his columned mansion. The plantation's considerable wealth was built on broken bodies and crushed spirits of over 100 slaves who toiled from dawn until dusk under the merciless southern sun. "The Lord gave me dominion over you," he would declare in his booming voice before ordering punishments that left men twice Elijah's size begging for mercy, their backs flayed open beneath the overseer's lash. But what tormented Elijah most were the nights when screams echoed from the big house, the master's unpredictable rage finding new targets behind closed doors, particularly when he returned from town with whiskey on his breath and darkness in his eyes. Yet in secret, stolen moments, Elijah had found small victories that sustained his spirit. A discarded newspaper page hidden carefully in his straw mattress in the cramped slave quarters, letters traced in dirt with a stick and memorized before being swept away by his barefoot. Words, powerful forbidden words that he taught himself by moonlight, filtering through the cracks in the wooden walls, while others collapsed into exhausted sleep around him. He built a fortress in his mind where Master Wilkes could never reach, brick by mental brick. Each new word was a weapon in his silent rebellion, each sentence a shield against despair. In a world where his body was not his own, where his labor and pain were commodities to be exploited, his mind remained gloriously, defiantly unshackled. But what Elijah didn't know, as he kept his eyes downcast and his thoughts hidden, was that someone else on plantation was watching him just as carefully as he watched everyone else. From behind the lace curtains of the big house's second-floor windows, a pair of troubled eyes had noticed his careful disguise, had seen the intelligence he fought to conceal, and she was about to change everything in ways neither of them could possibly imagine. Mrs. Eleanor Wilkes was not what the slaves expected of a plantation mistress. Unlike the neighboring wives, with their haughty demeanors and casual cruelties, their silk dresses rustling as they ordered punishments for imagined offenses, she moved through the grand house like a ghost, pale, quiet, and seemingly haunted by something no one could name. Her delicate features, once beautiful enough to turn heads in Charleston's finest drawing rooms, had grown drawn over 7 years of marriage, and the fine dresses from her trousseau hung loose on her diminishing frame. The servants whispered that she ate like a bird, pushing food around her plate. During the elaborate dinners her husband insisted upon, even when they dined alone, the daughter of a prosperous Charleston merchant who had made his fortune in the textile trade, Eleanor had arrived at Willow Creek Plantation in the spring of 1842 with a trunk full of leather-bound books, watercolor supplies, and dreams of a gentle life with a charming man who had courted her with poetry and promises. That illusion shattered during their first week of marriage when Jeremiah Wilkes, drunk on expensive brandy and drunk on power, showed her exactly what kind of man he truly was beneath the veneer of southern gentility. The bruises faded from her alabaster skin, but the knowledge remained etched into her soul. She was as much a prisoner as any soul on the plantation. Her gilded cage perhaps more spacious, but no less confining. Eleanor found small ways to rebel against her husband's tyranny, tiny acts of defiance that kept her spirit from being completely crushed under his boot. She insisted on treating injuries the overseer deemed unworthy of attention, applying salves and bandages with her own hands. Despite Jeremiah's mockery of her delicate sensibilities, she secretly taught the house slave children their letters when they brought her tea or helped with her toilet until Jeremiah discovered her transgression and sold 2 of her young pupils to a trader. Heading west toward the brutal cotton fields of Mississippi, after that devastating punishment, she retreated further into herself, speaking only when spoken to, moving through the house like a pale shadow of the vibrant woman who had once filled drawing rooms with laughter and intelligent conversation. But Eleanor watched. Behind her downcast eyes that seemed to notice nothing lay a mind cataloging every injustice, every casual brutality that defined life at Willow Creek. She noticed the careful way young Elijah avoided drawing attention to himself in the yard, how he sometimes mouthed words when he thought no one was looking, the way his eyes lingered on the newspapers Jeremiah left scattered about before they were used to light fires. She recognized in him a fellow prisoner, one who had found ways to preserve something of himself despite everything, a kindred spirit maintaining an inner sanctum where freedom still existed. On a sweltering afternoon in late August, when the air hung heavy with humidity and the scent of magnolia, Jeremiah rode to Natchez for a 3-day gambling excursion with neighboring planters. Eleanor stood on the veranda, maintaining the expected welly farewell, her hand raised in a delicate wave until his horse disappeared down the Oakline Drive. Only then did she allow her mask to slip, a look of determination crossing her features as she turned back to the house with purposeful steps. She had watched Elijah long enough to know his habits, how he slipped into the barn during his brief midday meal to read scraps of paper by the light filtering through the haft, how he concealed his dangerous literacy with a caution born of witnessing others punished for similar transgressions with trembling hands that grew steadier with each passing moment. She went to the small bookshelf in her private sitting room and selected a slim volume, Wordsworth's poems, a gift from her father that Jeremiah had deemed suitable enough for a woman's limited understanding. She wrapped the precious book in a square of linen cloth and tucked it into the deep pocket of her apron. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she crossed the yard, nodding to the house slaves who watched her with curious eyes, unaccustomed to seeing the mistress venture beyond the garden without purpose. The barn door creaked on its hinges as she pushed it open, stepping from blinding sunlight into cool shadow. Dust motes danced in the beams of light that streamed through the gaps in the weathered wood. The smell of hay and horses enveloped her as she paused, allowing her eyes to adjust to the dimness. For the first time in years, Eleanor Wilkes felt something other than fear or resignation flowing through her veins. She felt purpose and the dangerous, intoxicating flutter of hope that perhaps in this unlikely alliance, she might find a way to strike back against the cruelty that defined her existence. What she was about to do could get them both killed, but in that moment, the risk seemed a small price to pay for even the smallest taste of defiance. Elijah froze when the barn door opened, instinctively tucking the scrap of newspaper into his waistband with practiced efficiency. The movement was so fluid, so natural after years of concealment, that it would have been imperceptible to most observers. Sunlight silhouetted the slender figure in the doorway, casting long shadows across the packed dirt floor, and his heart hammered against his ribs with such force he feared it might be audible in the sudden silence. Discovery meant punishment, perhaps worse if they realized he could read. Stories circulated among the enslaved about men who had their fingers broken for holding a pen, women who had their eyes damaged for looking at books. He lowered his eyes and adopted the deferential posture expected of him, shoulders slightly hunched, head bowed, hands loose at his sides, the carefully choreographed dance of submission that had kept him alive thus far. His muscles tensed beneath his sweat-dampened shirt, ready to receive whatever came next. Elijah, the soft voice of Mrs. Wilkes, surprised him. She rarely spoke directly to the field hands and never sought them out. Her domain was the big house with its polished floors and heavy draperies, a world entirely separate from brutal reality of the fields where he spent his days bent double beneath the southern sun. "Yes," he replied, eyes still fixed on the dirt floor where a colony of ants marched in determined formation toward a crack in the barn wall. He noticed everything, always, a survival skill honed since childhood. Eleanor glanced nervously over her shoulder before stepping further into the barn shadows. The heavy door swung partially closed behind her, leaving just enough space for light to filter through, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air between them. "I know what you've been doing in here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, the words carrying the weight of dangerous knowledge. Elijah remained silent, calculating his chances of denying whatever accusation was coming. His mind raced through possible explanations for his presence in the barn, seeking shelter from the heat, checking on a sick animal, anything but the truth. The mistress approached slowly as one might approach a wounded animal, stopping several feet away. The scent of lavender water drifted toward him, so incongruous in the barn's atmosphere of hay and horse sweat that it seemed to belong to another world entirely. "You don't need to hide it from me," she continued, her accent betraying her Charleston upbringing, the rounded vowels and gentle cadence so different from her husband's harsh tones. "I've seen how carefully you watch the newspapers, how you mouth the words when you think no one notices, how your eyes linger on the spines of books when you dust the library." He risked a glance upward, confused by her tone. There was no anger there, no righteous indignation, only a strange intensity that he couldn't decipher. Her blue eyes, usually downcast in her husband's presence, now held a spark of something that looked almost like conspiracy. Her hands, with their long, elegant fingers and carefully maintained nails, twisted nervously in the fabric of her apron, hands that had never known hard labor, now fidgeting with an anxiety he recognized all too well. With trembling fingers, Eleanor reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a cloth-wrapped object about the size of her palm. "I thought you might prefer this to scraps and fragments." She unwrapped the small book and held it out, the leather binding catching the light, the gold-embossed title faintly gleaming. "It's poetry, words that can take you far from here if only in your mind." Elijah stared at the offering, uncomprehending. The mistress of the plantation was giving him a book. It had to be a trap, a test of some kind, perhaps orchestrated by Master Wilkes to catch him in forbidden knowledge. He had seen such cruel games played before, seeming kindness offered only to justify brutal punishment. When the gift was accepted, "Take it," she urged, her voice gaining strength. "My husband won't be back for 3 days. No one will know." A flush of color appeared on her pale cheeks, the first sign of vitality he had seen in her countenance for years. Why, the question escaped before he could stop himself, the single word hanging dangerously between them, questioning a white person, especially the mistress, was itself an act of rebellion that could earn him the lash. Eleanor's pale face showed a flicker of emotion, something between sadness and determination. Her lips pressed together briefly before she answered, "Because we're both prisoners here in different ways. Because knowledge is the only true freedom." Her voice strengthened with each word, as though speaking these thoughts aloud was breaking through years of enforced silence. "Because I've watched him break too many spirits, and I won't let him break yours. Not when I see in you what I've lost in myself." Slowly, as if expecting the book to vanish like morning mist, Elijah reached out and took it from her hands. The leather binding felt cool against his calloused fingers, the weight of it substantial, yet somehow lighter than he expected, as though the words inside defied physical laws. He ran his thumb carefully along the gilded edges of the pages, marveling at their uniformity and finesse. "Can you read it?" she asked, watching his face with an intensity that suggested his answer mattered deeply to her. Some, he admitted, the most dangerous confession he'd ever made to anyone at Willow Creek. "I taught myself mostly from scraps and hearing others, piecing letters together until they made sense." The admission hung in the air between them, a capital offense in most of the South, punishable but mutilation or worse. A ghost of a smile touched Eleanor's lips, transforming her face momentarily into that of a much younger woman. "Then I'll help you with the rest." She glanced toward the door, the habitual caution of the oppressed evident in her movement. I can come here during your midday break. We'll have to be careful. If anyone asks, I'm checking on the new foe." Her fingers twisted in her apron again. "I was a teacher's assistant before I married." I remember how Elijah finally met her gaze directly, a man looking at a woman rather than a slave at his mistress. Perhaps the first truly honest exchange either had experienced on the plantation. In her eyes he saw something he recognized, the same hunger for escape, for something beyond the boundaries of Willow Creek Plantation, the same desperate clinging to humanity in a place designed to strip it away. He nodded once, a solemn pact sealed between unlikely conspirators. "Tomorrow, then," Eleanor said, turning to leave. She paused at the door, one hand resting on the weathered wood as sunlight outlined her slender form once more. "Elijah, if we're caught, I stole the book," he finished for her, the words coming without hesitation. They both knew the consequences would be vastly different for each of them. A beating or worse for him, perhaps, but social humiliation for her. Yet in that moment, the risk seemed a price worth paying for this small rebellion. After she left, closing the door carefully behind her, Elijah sank down onto a bale of hay, his legs suddenly weak. He opened the book with reverent care, mindful of the precious paper and binding. Wordsworth's poems, words that had nothing to do with cotton yields or plantation accounts or the brutal economics of human bondage, words about nature, beauty, and freedom. Concepts so far removed from his daily existence that they might as well have been written in a foreign tongue. He traced the first line with his finger, savoring each syllable like precious water in a drought. "I wandered lonely as a cloud." The dinner bell would ring soon, calling him back to the fields for the afternoon's labor, his back already itched from the morning's work, and the overseer would be watching for any sign of slacking. But for these few stolen moments, Elijah held something that belonged solely to him, knowledge that couldn't be taken away, words that opened doors in his mind that no master could lock. For the first time since he was a child, before he understood the full meaning of the chains that bound him, Elijah felt the dangerous stirring of hope, not for physical freedom, which seemed as distant as the stars, but for a liberation of the mind that might sustain him through whatever lay ahead. In this unlikely alliance with the mistress of Willow Creek, he had found something he thought lost forever, the possibility of more than mere survival. Over the next 2 weeks, a routine emerged as delicate and dangerous as walking a tightrope suspended over a ravine. Each day, when the midday bell rang out across the fields, Eleanor would find a reason to leave the house, checking on the garden's progress, inspecting linens hung to dry in the summer breeze, or inquiring about the new foe whose birth had provided such a convenient excuse. Her justifications varied, carefully crafted to seem inconsequential to anyone who might notice her movements, but her destination remained the same. The barn, with its weathered boards and sweet hay-scented shadows, became their sanctuary, a place where status momentarily dissolved in the shared communion of words. Their first lesson had been awkward, filled with hesitation on both sides. Eleanor, once confident guiding young ladies through their primers in a Charleston schoolroom, found herself stumbling to explain concepts she had always taken for granted. How to parse complex sentences, how to decipher the metaphorical language that made poetry sing. Elijah, fearful of revealing how much he already knew, held back until she gently coaxed him to show his true abilities, assuring him with whispered words that this space for these precious stolen moments was safe for honesty. "You read better than most free men I've known," she had said with genuine surprise on that first day, after he had carefully worked through a stanza of W.D.'s Worth, his finger tracing beneath each word with a reverence that made her throat tighten. "Had to be careful learning," he replied, his voice low despite their solitude. Watching without being seen, watching, listening without seeming to listen, remembering everything because writing it down wasn't possible. His eyes, when they briefly met hers, held a quiet pride, tempered by caution, the look of a man who had achieved something remarkable against impossible odds, yet could never openly claim his accomplishment. Now, on the 14th day of their dangerous arrangement, Elijah sat on an upturned bucket while Eleanor perched on a hay bale, her skirts carefully arranged to minimize contact with the dusty surface. though she had long since stopped caring about the state of her clothing when she returned to the house. The book lay open between them, their hands occasionally brushing as they turned pages. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the barn wall, painting golden stripes across the pages and illuminating motes of dust that danced in the still air like tiny constellations. "The world is too much with us late and soon," Eleanor read, her voice gaining strength with each session. Where once she had spoken barely above a whisper, fear strangling her words, she now read with quiet confidence, finding in these recitations echoes of woman she had been before. Marriage had diminished her. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. Elijah closed his eyes, letting the words wash over him like cool water. He had discovered that poetry, with its rhythms and cadences, spoke to something deep within him, something that had survived despite everything that had been done to break it. The language of W.D.'s Worth, so different from the crude commands and threats that usually filled his days, nourished a part of his soul he had protected fiercely since childhood. When she finished the sonnet, he opened his eyes to find her watching him, a curious expression on her face, part wonder, part recognition. "What do you think W.D.'s Worth meant?" she asked. Their discussions had gradually evolved from simple reading exercises to explorations of meaning, interpretations that revealed as much about them as about the text itself. Eleanor had discovered that Elijah possessed an insight that surpassed many of the educated men she had known in her previous life. The people are too busy with things, possessions, money, status, to see what's real, he said slowly, choosing his words with care as he always did. They forget to notice the world around them, the beauty that can't be owned or sold. Too caught up in the business of living to remember what makes life worth experiencing. Eleanor nodded, a strand of auburn hair escaping from her simple coiffure to brush against her cheek. "Yes, exactly. He's lamenting how people have become disconnected from nature and true feeling, how commerce has replaced communion with the world." She hesitated, then added softly, rather like, "Everyone here is blind to the true nature of—" She stopped abruptly, her courage failing as she approached the unspoken boundary they had both carefully maintained, of slavery. Elijah finished for her, his voice steady but quiet. The word hung in the air between them, dangerous and liberating all at once. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle in the pasture and the occasional stamp of a horse's hoof in a nearby stall. They had carefully avoided direct discussion of the institution that defined their respective positions, dancing around it like a flame that could consume them both if they ventured too close. "Yes," she finally whispered, her fingers tracing the edge of the book's worn binding. "They see the economics, the convenience, the supposed necessity, but not the—" She struggled for words, her education failing her in this moment of raw truth. "Humanity," he supplied, the single word containing volumes of meaning. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears that she did not attempt to hide from him. A vulnerability she would have concealed from anyone else at Willow Creek. "I was raised to accept it all without question. Even when I came here as a bride, I didn't truly see." She twisted her hands in her lap, the gold band on her left finger catching the light, a symbol of another kind of bondage, "until I became a kind of property myself." The confession hung in the air between them, intimate and painful. Elijah remained silent, understanding that some wounds couldn't be acknowledged with words, that bearing witness was sometimes the only possible response. His own scars, both visible and invisible, testified to truths too profound for language. The distant sound of approaching horses broke the moment, hoof beats on the packed earth of the drive, sending a jolt of alarm through them both. Eleanor stood quickly, brushing hay from her skirts with trembling hands. "Someone's coming," she whispered, alarm sharpening her features, draining the color from her cheeks. Elijah was already moving, sliding the book into its hiding place beneath a loose floorboard they had discovered on the third day of their meetings. They had planned for this contingency, rehearsed their responses should they ever be discovered. "The foe seems to be recovering nicely," Elinor said loudly, smoothly transitioning to their cover story, her voice carrying enough to be heard by anyone approaching. "Continue with the treatment I suggested and inform me if there's any change in his condition." "Yes," Elijah replied, his posture shifting back to appropriate difference, eyes lowered, shoulders slightly hunched. The transformation so complete, it was as if the man who had discussed poetry moments before had never existed. "Thank you for checking, Mrs. I'll do as you say." She nodded and moved toward the door, composing her features into the mask of gentle indifference she wore in public. The expression of a woman who noticed nothing, questioned nothing, existed only as an ornament to her husband's household. Just before stepping outside, she glanced back at him, a moment of silent communication passing between them. A shared secret, a promise to continue, an acknowledgement that what had begun as lessons in literacy had become something far more profound. As Elinor left to greet whoever had arrived at the plantation, adjusting her pace to the unhurried glide expected of a Southern lady, Elijah returned to his assigned tasks. The poetry still echoing in his mind like music. Something had shifted between them today, some barrier fallen away that could never be rebuilt. In acknowledging her own bondage, the mistress had recognized his humanity in a way few whites ever did. The comparison was imperfect. She would never know the lash, would never face the auction block, would never have her children torn from her arms to be sold like livestock. But in her own gilded cage, she had found the empathy to see beyond the boundaries that separated them. He wondered, as he forked fresh hay into the stalls with practiced efficiency, how long their dangerous alliance could continue and where it might eventually lead them both. The poetry they read spoke of freedom of natural beauty, of the dignity of the human spirit, concepts that existed in stark contrast to the reality of Willow Creek Plantation. Such ideas once planted had a way of growing beyond control, sending roots deep into the soul and reaching toward the light, no matter what forces might try to contain them. As the sound of voices drifted from the direction of the main house, Jeremiah Wilkes's distinctive baritone among them returned earlier than expected from his business in town. Elijah felt a chill of apprehension. The master's moods were unpredictable at best, violent at worst, and his early return boded ill for everyone on the plantation, most of all for his wife. Elijah silently mouthed a line from the poem they had read that day. "Great God, I'd rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn." The words were a talisman against fear, a reminder that even here, even now, his mind remained his own. Tomorrow's lesson, if it happened at all, would reveal how much their fragile connection could withstand in the harsh light of Willow Creek's reality. For now, Elijah carefully locked away the memory of Elinor's tears, her confession, and the moment of true recognition that had passed between them. Treasures as precious and dangerous as the hidden book beneath the floorboards. Jeremiah Wills's unexpected return cast a shadow over Willow Creek that seemed to darken every corner of the plantation. The master had arrived in a foul mood, his business dealings in Charleston having gone poorly, and everyone from house servants to field hands felt the ripple effects of his displeasure. Eleanor had been summoned immediately to the study, and though the thick oak door muffled their conversation, the entire household held its breath, waiting. Elijah continued his work in stables, keeping his head down and his movements efficient. 3 days passed with no sign of Elinor, no clandestine meeting in the barn at midday. He did not allow himself to dwell on her absence, knowing that expectation was a luxury he could not afford. Yet each time the dinner bell rang, his eyes involuntarily drifted toward the main house before he forced them back to his tasks. On the 4th day after Wills's return, Elijah was milking out the stalls when he heard the barn door open. He didn't look up, assuming it was one of the other workers, or perhaps the overseer come to assign additional duties. The soft clearing of a throat made him freeze. "The foe requires checking again," Eleanor said, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by anyone nearby, maintaining their established pretense. Elijah turned slowly, pitchfork still in hand. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her posture rigid, her face partially obscured by the bonnet she wore. When she stepped further into the barn and the door swung closed behind her, he saw what she had been concealing, a darkening bruise along her left cheekbone, poorly hidden by powder. "Mrs." he acknowledged, his tone neutral despite the anger that flared in his chest. Eleanor moved to the stall where the foal dozed in the afternoon heat. "We may speak freely," she said quietly. "He's gone to the Jenkins plantation for the day. Something about a shipment of new workers." Her voice caught slightly on the euphemism. Elijah set the pitchfork aside and approached, maintaining a respectful distance. "I wasn't sure you'd come back." "Neither was I," she admitted, removing her bonnet. In the dim light, the bruise looked even worse, a violent bloom of purple and yellow that extended toward her temple. She caught his gaze and touched the mark self-consciously. He was displeased with the household accounts. Elijah said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't be dangerous for them both. "I've brought something different today," Eleanor continued, reaching into her pocket and withdrawing not their usual book of poetry, but a folded newspaper. "From Charleston, I thought. You might want to know what's happening beyond Willow Creek." She handed him the paper and their fingers brushed momentarily. Elijah unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the headlines. News of growing tensions between North and South, debates in Congress, reports from other states, information that was carefully filtered before it reached the ears of the enslaved. "Thank you," he said simply, understanding the risk she had taken in bringing this to him. Eleanor watched as he read, her expression unreadable. "There are rumors," she said finally, "that war may come, that the country cannot continue half slave and half free." "And if war comes," Elijah asked, looking up from the paper, "what happens to places like this, to people like me?" The question hung between them. Impossible to answer, yet impossible to ignore. "I don't know," she whispered, "but change is coming one way or another." "I can feel it." She glanced toward the door. "We should be careful today. Jeremiah may return early." They spent the next half hour with heads bent over the newspaper. Eleanor explaining context for stories Elijah might not fully understand. To FOLLOWINGSILENCE, between the POLITIC's L words, developments through fragments and overheard conversations. As they prepared to part ways, Eleanor hesitated. "Elijah," she said, her voice barely audible, "if things change, if the world beyond Willow Creek opens up somehow, what would you do?" The question was breathtaking in its implications, dangerous in ways that went beyond their shared reading. "I'd go north," he said after a long pause, "find my sister who was sold 5 years ago, learn openly without hiding." He met her eyes directly. "And you, Mrs., what would you do if things changed?" Eleanor touched her bruised cheek lightly. "I'd remember what it felt like to be free," she said. "I'd remember who I was before." The sound of a wagon approaching sent them both into motion. Eleanor quickly donning her bonnet, Elijah returning to his work. Their conversation about freedom and possibilities faded back into the careful performance of mistress and slave. But something had shifted again between them. In acknowledging the possibility of change, they had admitted to dreams that went beyond their daily survival. And in sharing those dreams, they had formed a bond that transcended the rigid boundaries of Willow Creek Plantation. A silent pact to remember that another world might be possible for both of them. The autumn of 1860 brought a harvest season unlike any other at Willow Creek Plantation. As cotton bolls burst open in white profusion across the fields, creating an ocean of snowy caps atop the green plants. Tension hung in the air, as tangible as the humidity that still clung to these Carolina lowlands. The usual rhythms of plantation life, the methodical picking, the creaking wagons laden with the day's yield, the constant vigilance of the overseers, continued as they had for generations. But beneath this choreographed routine, undercurrents of unease flowed like the nearby Ashley River, deep and unpredictable. News traveled slowly to this isolated corner of South Carolina, filtered through the careful censorship of those who controlled what information reached enslaved ears. But even here, the whispers of political upheaval reached those hungry for any morsel of hope. Abraham Lincoln's name was spoken in hushed tones in the big house, with contempt and fear by the master and his associates, and with cautious hope in the slave quarters, where even the smallest promise of change was treasured like water in a drought. Elijah had become adept at gathering information. A newspaper left carelessly on the porch and hastily scanned while polishing boots. Conversations between the master and his visitors overheard from the garden beneath the veranda. Fragments shared by the house servants who moved invisibly through rooms where white men spoke freely, believing themselves unobserved by any mind capable of understanding. These precious scraps he pieced together during his increasingly perilous meetings with Eleanor, which had become less frequent but more urgent as Jeremiah Wilkes grew increasingly volatile, his temper flaring at the slightest provocation as reports from Charleston fueled his political anxieties. On a crisp November morning, with the first real chill of the season settling over the plantation, Elijah was repairing a broken fence post that marked the boundary between the south pasture and cotton fields. His hands worked mechanically, driving nails with practiced precision, while his mind wandered to the snippet of conversation he'd overheard the previous evening. Something about a telegram from Columbia that had sent the master into a rage, resulting in a broken decanter and another bruise blooming on Eleanor's arm, visible when she'd reached for the teapot. At breakfast, he was so absorbed in these thoughts that he didn't notice Thomas approaching until the house servant was nearly upon him. Thomas, a dignified man in his 50s, who had served the Wilkes family since before Jeremiah inherited the plantation, moved with the deliberate grace of someone who had learned that sudden movement could bring unwanted attention. "Elijah," Thomas said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't observed. "Mrs. wants you at the main house, says the study door needs fixing. Hinge come loose again." Elijah nodded, understanding the coded message they had developed over recent months. The study door, which had indeed needed repair once in August, had become their signal for urgent communication when their usual meeting place wasn't safe. He gathered his tools and followed Thomas back to the house, maintaining a respectful distance that would appear proper to any watching eyes. "Master's mood?" Elijah asked under his breath as they walked. "Storm clouds," Thomas replied cryptically. "Been shut up with that Charleston newspaper since dawn." Broke his shaving mirror. The older man's expression remained impassive, but his eyes conveyed volumes. "Mrs. sent most of the house staff to the kitchen garden, giving you as much time as she can." The main house loomed white and imposing against the clear blue sky, its column facade a monument to wealth built on human suffering. The Greek Revival architecture, so beloved by plantation aristocracy for its associations with ancient democracy, stood as an ironic testament to the profound hypocrisy that underpinned Southern society. Elijah entered through the back door, keeping his eyes lowered as he passed the kitchen where cook was preparing the midday meal, her movements brisk with suppressed anxiety. Another sign that the household existed on edge. The rich aroma of roasting meat reminded him painfully of his own meager breakfast hours earlier. A handful of cornmeal mush and a strip of salt pork that did little to sustain a man through a morning of physical labor. His stomach clenched with familiar hunger, but he pushed the sensation aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. Thomas led him to the study and knocked softly on the mahogany door, its polished surface reflecting their distorted images. "Bro Elijah for the door, Mrs." he announced, his tone perfectly calibrated to convey difference without subservience. A distinction Elijah had come to admire in the older man. "Come in," Eleanor called, her voice carrying the carefully modulated cadence she used when playing her role as plantation mistress. Elijah entered to find Eleanor standing by the window, her slender figure silhouetted against the morning light that streamed through the leaded glass. She wore a simple blue dress, its color reminiscent of the forget-me-nots that grew wild along the creek that gave the plantation its name. Her hair was pulled back in a practical style that suited her far better than the elaborate arrangements Jeremiah preferred for social occasions. Thomas closed the door behind them, leaving them alone in the Bookland sanctuary that had become improbably their most secure meeting place. "Thank you for coming," Eleanor said, her voice steady, but her eyes revealing her agitation. The blue irises seemed darker today, shadowed with concern. "We don't have much time. Jeremiah has gone to a meeting in town with the Middleton brothers, but he'll return by early afternoon. He rode in a state of such agitation that I fear what news he may bring back." Elijah set his tools down by the door, maintaining the pretense should anyone enter unexpectedly. He straightened up, allowing himself to stand at his full height rather than the slightly hunched posture he adopted in the presence of whites. In this room, for these brief stolen moments, some of the crushing weight of performance could be set aside. "What's happened?" he asked, moving closer, but still maintaining a distance that acknowledged the boundaries they could never fully transcend, despite their extraordinary connection. Eleanor crossed to her husband. Massive oak desk, imported from England at great expense, as Jeremiah often reminded visitors, and withdrew a folded paper from beneath a leather-bound ledger. Her hands trembled slightly, betraying the emotion her composed face concealed. "Lincoln has been elected," she said, handing him the newspaper. "The results are final. South Carolina's worst fear has come to pass. A Republican president who opposes the expansion of slavery, if not its existence." Elijah took the paper, his callous fingers handling the delicate newsprint with care, born of reverence for written word and all it represented. The headline confirmed her words in bold type. "Abraham Lincoln elected 16th President of the United States." Below, smaller text declared, "Black Republican victory signals crisis for Southern states." A tremor passed through him, not of fear, but of something he dared not name even to himself, a dangerous emotion that felt too much like hope. "There's more," Eleanor continued, her voice dropping further as though the very walls might betray their conversation. "Talk of secession has become action. The state legislature has called for a convention. South Carolina may leave the Union within weeks. Jeremiah and the other plantation owners are meeting today to discuss their response and to organize local militias." Her fingers twisted the cameo at her throat, a nervous habit she had developed over months of increasing anxiety. "They speak of war as though it were inevitable, even desirable." "And if South Carolina secedes?" Elijah asked, though he already knew the implications. Their discussions had explored this possibility for months as the presidential campaign heightened sectional tensions. "War becomes more likely," she replied simply. "Everything changes." The weight of those two words, "everything changes," hung between them like the sword of Damocles, both threatening and promising. For nearly 3 months, their dangerous friendship had expanded beyond literature to include discussions of politics, philosophy, and the future. Eleanor had shared books by Frederick Douglass and Harriet Beecher Stowe, smuggled from Charleston by a sympathetic cousin who believed her interest was merely intellectual curiosity. Elijah had revealed more of his past, the family torn apart by sales to pay his first master's gambling debts, the brutal overseer at his previous plantation who had nearly killed him for learning to write, the dreams of freedom that sustained him through each day of bondage. "The master has been stockpiling weapons," Elijah said quietly, sharing information that could cost him his life if Wilkes discovered he knew such things. "New rifles came last week, a dozen at least." They're stored in the old tobacco shed behind the overseer's cabin, and powder, enough for a small army. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. How do you know this? People don't notice what they think can't understand them, he replied with the faintest hint of bitter humor. Men like Wilkes speak freely around those they consider no more intelligent than their hunting dogs. I hear everything. She nodded, accepting this truth that had become increasingly evident to her since their first meeting in the barn. Jeremiah has been corresponding with militia leaders in Charleston and Columbia. He speaks of fighting to protect our way of life, as though it were something sacred rather than an abomination before God and man. Her voice held a bitterness that had grown stronger with each passing month, as her education through Elijah's eyes had stripped away the comfortable illusions of her upbringing. Elijah carefully refolded the newspaper and returned it to her, knowing that possession of such material would be impossible to explain if he were searched. A regular occurrence for men in his position. "What will you do?" he asked, the question that had become central to their conversations. As the national crisis deepened, Eleanor turned back to the window, gazing out at the plantation that was both her prison and her protection. Beyond the manicured gardens lay fields where dozens of men, women, and children bent beneath the November sun, harvesting the crop that had built Jeremiah Wilkes's fortune and secured her comfortable existence. The juxtaposition was not lost on her, not anymore. "My father has written from Charleston asking me to return home before unpleasantness makes travel difficult." Her hands gripped the windowsill, knuckles whitening with pressure. "He fears for my safety should conflict erupt, though his concern is more for the Wilkes name and bloodline than for my happiness." She gave a small, humorless laugh. "Jeremiah has refused. He says a wife's place is with her husband, especially in times of crisis. That my departure might be seen as lack of confidence in the Southern cause." Elijah remained silent, knowing there was nothing he could offer beyond his presence, his willingness to listen when so few would hear her. The parallels between their situations, both effectively owned by Jeremiah Wilkes, both denied basic freedoms, had become a central thread in their relationship, though Eleanor never presumed to equate her gilded cage with Elijah's iron one. "And you," she asked, turning to face him again, "what will you do if war comes?" It was a question they had circled many times, but today it carried new urgency. The hypothetical suddenly transformed into imminent reality by Lincoln's election and its certain consequences. "Some say Union soldiers will free any slave who reaches their lines," he said carefully, weighing each word. "Others say nothing will change, that one master will simply be replaced by another, that even if slavery ends, something just as cruel will take its place." He met her gaze directly, a liberty he allowed himself only in these private moments. "But if there's even a chance for freedom, I have to try. For myself, for my sister in Georgia, for all of us." Eleanor moved closer, lowering her voice though they were alone. "There are people who help, networks that guide those seeking freedom to safe places. My cousin in Charleston has connections." She mentioned an organization of Quakers who the sound of approaching hoof-beat hats cut her off mid-sentence. They both froze, listening as horses galloped up the drive far earlier than expected. The rhythmic pounding seemed to echo the sudden acceleration of Elijah's heartbeat as adrenaline flooded his system. "Jeremiah," Eleanor whispered, her face paling beneath its light dusting of rice powder, "you must go quickly." Elijah gathered his tools, his movements efficient and practiced from a lifetime of needing to disappear at a moment's notice. At the door he paused, knowing that this conversation, perhaps their last for some time, couldn't end without acknowledgement of what had grown between them, a connection that transcended the rigid hierarchies of their world. "Whatever happens," he said softly, "remember what W.D. Worth wrote, 'The world is too much with us. There's more beyond Willow Creek for both of us.'" Eleanor nodded, composing her features into the mask of submission she wore in her husband's presence. The transformation was remarkable and heartbreaking. The intelligent, passionate woman receding behind the facade of the demure Southern wife. "Fix the hinge properly this time," she said loudly for the benefit of anyone who might be listening. "It's been sticking for weeks." "Yes, Mrs." Elijah replied, slipping back into his role as easily as donning a familiar coat, his posture shifting, his gaze lowering. "I'll see to it right away." He left the study and headed toward the back door, passing Thomas in the hallway with a brief nod that communicated everything necessary. Outside, he could see Jeremiah Wilkes dismounting from his L-thered horse, his face flushed with excitement or anger, the two emotions often indistinguishable on the master's countenance. Several other plantation owners accompanied him, their voices carrying across the yard as they discussed taking action and defending our rights. With the fervor of men convinced of their own righteousness, Elijah kept his head down as he crossed to the workshop, but his mind was racing with the implications of what he'd learned. Lincoln's election, South Carolina's imminent secession, the gathering storm of conflict, all pointed to a future where the carefully maintained order of Willow Creek might fracture, creating spaces through which one might slip away toward freedom. That night, as he lay on his pallet in the cramped cabin he shared with 4 other men, listening to their breathing and the occasional cough from old Joseph, whose lungs had been damaged by years in the rice fields, Elijah stared at the rough honeyed ceiling and made a decision. If war came, he would be ready. He would watch and wait for the right moment. He would gather information, prepare supplies, study routes north, and when the opportunity presented itself, as it surely must in the chaos of conflict, he would seize the chance that history was offering, not just for himself, but perhaps for a leaner too, whose gilded cage had become as unbearable as his iron one. Their fates had become intertwined in ways neither could have imagined that first day in the barn. Whatever came next, he knew with certainty that neither could find freedom without the other. Outside, an owl called into the darkness, its haunting cries seeming to echo the question that hung over Willow Creek Plantation and indeed the entire nation. When morning came, what new world might be dawning? As Elijah finally drifted towards sleep, the first drops of rain began to fall on the cabin roof, gentle harbingers of the storm to come. The secession convention in Charleston was called for December 20th, but Willow Creek Plantation had already transformed into a fortress weeks before. The manicured elegance that had defined the estate for generations now yielded to a martial atmosphere as Jeremiah Wilkes, like many of his peers throughout South Carolina, anticipated conflict with a mixture of bravado and grim determination that masked a deeper current of anxiety. The first frost of December had arrived early, dusting the fields with crystalline white, and limning the slave cabins with a deceptive beauty that did nothing to warm those within. Rifle drills echoed across the frost-covered fields 3 times weekly as local men, plantation owners, their sons, and even overseers gathered to prepare for what they called inevitable defense of our sovereignty. They marched in ragged formation across the foul cotton fields, their breath visible in the cold air, their enthusiasm for potential bloodshed unsettling to observe. Jeremiah had commissioned a flag, the palmetto and crescent of South Carolina emblazoned on blue silk, which now flew from a newly erected flagpole where the stars and stripes had once been. He spoke constantly of northern aggression and constitutional rights, his rhetoric growing more inflamed with each passing day as reports arrived from Charleston of the convention's progress. Eleanor watched these preparations from the parlor window, her breath fogging the glass on cold mornings as she traced patterns with her fingertip, invisible messages that disappeared as quickly as they formed. Her world had contracted further since Lincoln's election. Jeremiah now demanded she account for every hour of her day. Her correspondence was read before being sent, and her movements were restricted under the guise of protection against uncertain times. The bruises on her wrists, hidden beneath lace cuffs, testified to the consequences of questioning these new constraints. The meetings with Elijah had become nearly impossible, reduced to fleeting moments of exchanged glances and carefully coded messages passed through Thomas, whose age and apparent docility rendered him invisible to Jeremiah's suspicious gaze. A book left open to a particular page, a handkerchief dropped near the stables, a comment about the weather. These became their cipher, inadequate, but necessary. The slave quarters hummed with their own tension. Overseers had become more vigilant, punishments more severe for minor infractions, as though Jeremiah and his kind sensed precariousness of their control and sought to reinforce it through heightened brutality. Yet paradoxically, this increased oppression only strengthened the resolve of those who dared to dream of freedom. Whispers of Lincoln, of secession, of war, and of potential liberation circulated in hushed conversations after dark. When the overseers retreated to their cabins with their whiskey, their own fears of the future, on the morning of December 21st, a rider arrived from Charleston, his horse L, there despite the cold steam rising from its flanks in the winter air. Eleanor was arranging holly branches in the foyer, their red berries bright against the dark green leaves, a task that once would have been assigned to a house servant, but which she now performed herself, finding solace in the simple labor and the momentary freedom from Jeremiah's watchful eye. The front door burst open without ceremony, admitting a blast of cold air, and a young man Eleanor recognized as the son of a prominent Charleston attorney. His riding boots tracked mud across the polished floor as he called for the master without so much as acknowledging her presence. Jeremiah emerged from his study, eyes alight with anticipation. "William, what news?" "It's done," the messenger announced, breathless from his hard ride and the weight of his tidings. "The ordinance was signed yesterday afternoon. South Carolina has seceded from the Union. We are an independent republic." Jeremiah's triumphant whoop echoed through the house, startling a maid who dropped a tray of polishing silver with a clatter that went unremarked in the excitement. He clapped the messenger on the shoulder with uncharacteristic camaraderie and ordered champagne brought up from the cellar. French champagne he had been saving for precisely this occasion. "Send riders to the Middletons and the Ravenels," he instructed the hovering house servant, "to all the families within 10 miles. Tell them the deed is done and we'll celebrate tonight at Willow Creek. Eleanor," he turned to his wife, his face flushed with excitement, "prepare the house for guests. This is a historic day, the beginning of our true independence." Eleanor nodded, her expression carefully composed. Reveal nothing of the dread that pulled in her stomach at his words. "Of course, Jeremiah. I'll see to it immediately." By afternoon, Willow Creek buzzed with activity as local gentry gathered to celebrate what they viewed as the dawn of a new era. Carriages lined the drive, horses stamping in the cold as elegantly dressed men and women arrived bearing gifts of wine and sweetmeats. The house blazed with light from every window. Fires roared in all the fireplaces, and the scent of roasting meat and baking bread filled the air. A feast prepared by enslaved hands to celebrate an independence that would further entrench their bondage. In the slave quarters, the news spread differently, in whispers, in questions, in cautious speculation about what this political earthquake might mean. Some feared change of any kind, knowing from bitter experience that upheaval often brought new suffering rather than relief. Others nursed fragile hope that conflict between white men might somehow create opportunities for black liberation. Most simply waited, as they had been forced to wait through generations of oppression, for the next turn of a wheel they could not control. Elijah moved among his fellow enslaved, gathering impressions, tempering expectations, planting seeds of possibility without nurturing false hope. "Nothing changes today," he told a group of younger men who spoke rashly of escape in the confusion. "Today is just words on paper, but tomorrow might bring opportunities for those who are prepared." The celebration in the big house continued well into the night. Bonfires were lit on the lawn, casting dancing shadows across the white columns of the mansion. Jeremiah ordered barrels of whiskey opened for the white workers and overseers, though he kept the fine brassais and wines for his social equals in the house. The sounds of drunken revelry, boisterous patriotic songs, impromptu speeches, and occasional gunshots fired into the air, carried across the plantation like a declaration of impending chaos. Eleanor moved through the crowded rooms like a ghost, performing her duties as hostess with mechanical precision, while her mind raced with the implications of the day's events. She filled glasses, directed servants, smiled at appropriate moments, and all the while watched her husband's increasing inebriation, watched the martial fervor building among the men, watched the clock that ticked inexorably toward midnight. In the kitchen, where she retreated briefly under the pretense of checking on the refreshments, she found Cook, a formidable woman whose domain this was, regardless of who held legal title to the plantation. Cook had served the Wilkes family for 40 years, and had developed a keen sense for the currents of power and danger that flowed through the household. "Trouble coming, Mrs." Cook said quietly, her hands never pausing in their work of arranging pastries on a silver tray. "Big trouble, I know," Elena replied, her voice equally low. "Is there any word from quarters?" Cook's eyes flicked to the doorway to ensure they weren't overheard. People scared, people hopeful, people waiting. She slid a folded note across the countertop with practiced subtlety. "Thomas says to give you this from the stable boy." Eleanor's heart quickened. She palmed the note and slipped it into her sleeve in one smooth motion. "Thank you, Martha," she said, using Cook's given name, a rare acknowledgement of the woman's humanity that never failed to earn a flicker of appreciation in the older woman's eyes. "Best be careful," Mrs. Cook warned. "Master's in a dangerous mood. All of them are men with power afraid of losing it. Nothing more dangerous than that." Eleanor nodded, understanding the truth of these words better than most white women of her station would admit. "Oh, be careful. You do the same." It was nearly 11 when she finally found a moment to retreat to her private sitting room, ostensibly to fetch more handkerchiefs for the ladies who had been moved to tears by particularly stirring renditions of Dixie and other Southern anthems. With trembling fingers, she unfolded Elijah's note, a risk he rarely took, writing being both difficult for him given his limited opportunities to practice and dangerous evidence if discovered. The message was brief, written in a careful hand that betrayed the effort behind each letter. "Must speak important. Guarded. Shed midnight." Eleanor pressed the paper to her lips briefly, then held it to the candle flame, watching as the evidence curled and blackened before dropping the ash into her empty teacup. She checked her appearance in the mirror, pinched color into her pale cheeks, and returned to the celebration with renewed purpose, counting the minutes until she could slip away. At 11, she approached her husband, who stood in a circle of men discussing the formation of local militias with the intensity of those who have never experienced the reality of warfare. "Jeremiah," she said, placing a hand on his arm with a difference she no longer felt, but still performed flawlessly. "I fear I must retire. The excitement of the day has brought on one of my headaches." He glanced at her with irritation, but the presence of guests demanded a certain adherence to social norms. "Of course, my dear, these are overwhelming times for the delicate constitution of women." He patted her hand condescendingly. "Rest well. South Carolina's daughters must maintain their strength for the glorious days ahead." Several of the men nodded in agreement, their expressions a mixture of indulgence and dismissal that Eleanor had endured countless times in her life as a Southern lady. She curtsied slightly, the perfect picture of feminine submission, while calculating exactly how long it would take her to change her clothes and slip out through the side door near the kitchen. The house was full of guests, many of whom would stay the night rather than risk the journey home in darkness and potential frost. But the celebration had reached that point of inebriated self-absorption where her absence would go unremarked. Still, she took precautions, arranging pillows beneath her bed covers to suggest a sleeping form should anyone check, leaving her nightclothes visible on the dressing table and instructing her maid not to disturb her until morning. At 5 minutes before midnight, Eleanor slipped from the house wrapped in her heaviest cloak, its dark wool blending with the shadows as she made her way through the kitchen garden and past the dormant rose bushes, their thorny branches like skeletal fingers in the winter moonlight. The garden shed stood at the far edge of Eleanor's rose garden, a simple structure used to store tools and pots during the growing season, but rarely visited in winter months. She reached it without incident, grateful for the cloud cover that periodically obscured the moon, and for the continuing sounds of revelry from the house that masked any noise she might make. The shed door creaked slightly as she pushed it open, the interior pitch black after the faint illumination of the night sky. "Elijah," she whispered into the darkness. "Here," came his quiet reply from the corner furthest from the door. As her eyes adjusted, she could make out his form, taller than she remembered from their last meeting weeks ago. Or perhaps it was simply that here in this moment of danger and purpose, he stood at his full height rather than in the submissive posture required in the presence of whites. "We don't have much time," she whispered, keeping her voice low despite the distance from the house. "Jeremiah has finally fallen into a drunken sleep, but the house is full of guests who might wander the grounds for air." "I heard the news," Elijah said, his voice carrying the weight of its significance. "What does it mean for us?" "For all of us?" "War," Elena replied simply, the single syllable hanging between them in the cold air. "Perhaps not immediately, but inevitably. Lincoln cannot allow the Union to dissolve, and our men," she caught herself. "The Southern states will not return without bloodshed. Jeremiah and his friends speak of it with relish, as though it were a fox hunt rather than the slaughter of sons and brothers." She shivered, though whether from cold or fear, Elijah couldn't tell. "But that's not why I risked meeting you tonight." She withdrew a small package from beneath her cloak, wrapped in oilskin to protect it from moisture. "Maps," she explained, pressing them into his hands, "of the surrounding counties, the routes north, the Union strongholds that may exist once fighting begins. My father's library contained military surveys from the Mexican War that I've copied. And this," she produced a small leather pouch that clinked softly with the unmistakable sound of coins. "Money, not much, but enough to help if when the time comes." Elijah stared at the offerings, understanding their significance. These weren't merely tools for escape. They were Elena's declaration of allegiance, her rejection of everything she had been raised to believe, her commitment to a moral principle at the expense of her safety and position. See you in the next video.